Welcome to Jacksonian America, 1824 to 1840. This is Melinda Cole Klein. Jacksonian America, as the 1830s became known, brought major changes to society and politics. As Indian nations were moved out of the South and the Western Fringe, Jackson's popular appeal grew among frontier farmers and plantation slave owners. At the same time, Jackson refused to compromise democratic ideals if it meant keeping slavery as an institution for Southerners. In this era, while blacks in the South lived in bondage, the abolitionist movement in the North gained momentum. Andrew Jackson was the first in a long line of presidents boasting from humble origins, and furthered their career by denouncing what was called the privilege enjoyed by the wealthy Easterners. Through the sheer force of his personality, Andrew Jackson exemplified these dramatic political changes. Almost single-handedly, he extended limits of executive power and remade the American party system in the process. There were critics of Jacksonian politics to which these contradictions over time became ever more glaring. As the nation expanded its borders and diversified the economy, distinctions between social classes sharpened. The wage laborers could not easily afford to buy the cloth and shoes they produced with machines from their own factories. Manufactured goods found their way into wealthy and middle-class homes. All the while, suffrage restrictions continued to limit the access of non-property-owning white men. As a standard, a voting public invested in their community, such as landowners. They made the laws and their political voice known through the voting process. But many men rented their shops or the land they worked and could not vote. This age-old measurement for voting crumbled under the weight of the Jacksonian ideology of equality and spread to other constitutional governments, such as Britain. Historically speaking, those who owned land and paid taxes held the right to constitutional nations to be the body politic, the base of the politically active. Unless a free man owned land, he could not vote or be voted into politics. By these ideals, this limited access to political action by landowners, typically men of wealth, who had the time to dedicate their efforts to making laws and deliberating over what was best for their community or state. Missouri's admission to the Union as a slave state stressed sectional politics. By 1828, a new political party formed out of the slavery debate, the Democratic Party. But this ticket was not won until 1828 by Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson first ran for the presidency in 1824, but lost to John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams. Quincy Adams was first a Federalist and then became a Republican Democrat. A New Englander descended from a long and proud line of established families with ties to the economy and politics. However, by the 1820s, following the war with Britain that ended in 1815, Americans, especially small business entrepreneurs, farmers, and frontiersmen, had grown tired of elitists and their politics. Andrew Jackson brought voters something new, something a growing constituency could understand, and gave them someone to blame: corrupt politicians. Jackson appealed to the emotions of his voters. But Jackson was a wild card candidate because he lacked a college education and political experience. He was also considered a hothead. He made spur-of-the-moment decisions without thinking the possible consequences all the way through. Quincy Adams became a national Republican, standing as anti-Jacksonians. The National Republicans are not to be confused with the Republican Party, which is the GOP, established in 1854 with their first president in 1860, Abraham Lincoln. The second party system was established from 1828 election to 1854, promoted to encourage greater voter interest and participation. So many politicians did not trust Jackson's judgment. However, he was popular with the people and offered voters confidence. They voted for him the first time in 1824. In this election, Andrew Jackson had won the popular vote. He assumed he won the election, but his 99 electoral votes were 32 votes shy, as required under the Constitution's 12th Amendment. While the people vote in an election, it is the Electoral College, the members of Congress, who selects the next president. After November presidential elections, the second Tuesday of the month, Congress from their own states as members of the Electoral College officially selects the next president who will hold office. Today, this process is completed shortly after New Year's Day, weeks before the January 20th inauguration. The electoral votes are equal to the number of members of both houses of the U.S. Congress. Today, it is 435 House of Representatives and 100 senators, equaling 535 electoral votes, plus 3 allocated to Washington, D.C., equaling 538 electors. Since 1964, a U.S. president needs to have 270 electoral votes for a clear win. If the 270 is not reached, as in the case of Andrew Jackson, and also in the elections held 1876, 1888, and recently in 2000, the Electoral College elects the next president by casting their votes. While Henry Clay was eliminated in this election of 1824, he had made a deal with John Quincy Adams to be his Secretary of State. This strengthened Adams' popularity, and Congress gave him the presidency. This is remembered as the corrupt bargain, and rumors flew in Congress about this pair. Many in Washington were appalled with this political maneuvering on behalf of Adams and Clay. Jackson's defeat burnished his political credentials. However, since many voters believed the man of the people had been robbed by the corrupt aristocrats of the East. Like other Americans, Jackson promoted the fear that the government was in trouble. Unlike the Founding Fathers, Jackson believed that the president should have the popular majority in votes. This position was powerful by 1828. However, Jackson was made into a hero by his frontier supporters. By 1828, Jackson carried this election 68% of the electoral votes, with 178 in number, more than necessary to become the clear winner for the presidency. John Quincy Adams had run against him in this election, taking the New England states, while Jackson took the rest of the nation. For this election of 1828, Andrew Jackson, the Democrat, allied himself with the like-minded Southerners from South Carolina, John C. Calhoun. As a vice presidential candidate, the outspoken Calhoun brought much to this political partnership, as he was well-spoken and had much in the way of experience. Because of Jackson's outrage after losing the presidential election of 1824, he resigned his Senate seat from Florida and campaigned hard to convince Americans the political elite were corrupt. And this strategy worked. Some historians recognize the two presidential terms served by Andrew Jackson as a phase in which the office of the president was in fact reinvented. President Jackson, though unpopular often with an older generation of politicians, was beloved by Americans. While Andrew Jackson served the people well by disrupting national institutions such as the Second National Bank, and watched out for opportunities that would benefit his constituency the most. This included small business entrepreneurs, farmers, fishermen, whalers, and frontiersmen. As president, Jackson worked to take away the federal charter of the Second Bank of the United States. Jackson opposed the national bank concept on ideological and political grounds. In Jackson's veto, the bank needed to be abolished because it was unconstitutional. It concentrated an excessive amount of the nation's financial strength into a single institution. It exposed the government to control by foreign interests. It served mainly to make the rich richer. It exercised too much control over members of the Congress. It favored northeastern states over southern and western states. And this strategy worked well. While Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson differed, Jackson, like Jefferson, believed in the small businessman and entrepreneurial spirit as the backbone of the growing economy. In January 1835, there was an assassination attempt on his life, but it failed when Richard Lawrence's 2 pistols misfired. Again, like Thomas Jefferson, Jackson had his share of judgments that would decrease his popularity. Jackson chose for his Secretary of State Martin Van Buren, a bit dim-witted to say the least, but would succeed Jackson in the next election. Van Buren was a fair advisor and paid well, but the rest of his cabinet was filled with his old friends who were unfit for the positions they held. Jackson had attempted to replace some office holders with his own people. They were Democrats who had worked hard to get him elected, and this was their reward. However, this became known as the spoils system. One such Jackson appointee was Samuel Swarthout, the collecting agent of the Port of New York. Samuel accumulated $1.2 million in customs duties and absconded to Europe with a pretty woman of a cloudy character, all with federal funds. All the while, Jackson's opponents used this against him. Northern Republicans argued that Jackson was corrupting the government himself, the one thing he promised to correct in regards to the existing system. Another incident leaving Jackson with a tarnished image was the Peggy Eaton scandal, or otherwise known as the Petticoat Affair. There was growing talk that centered on Jackson's old friend, John Henry Eaton, who in his mid-50s married a tavern keeper's daughter. The flirtatious 29-year-old Peggy, in 1829, had been married, but her husband recently committed suicide over rumors of her affair with Eaton. Knowing this looked bad on Jackson, John asked for his blessing and protection. By the 1820s and the 1830s, American politicians were transitioning from leaving their wives and children at home while in Washington to live in a bachelor and sometimes reckless lifestyle in Washington, D.C. This gave way to politicians buying second homes in town, becoming high-profile like society. Leaders of this society held great dinners, parties, and dances while talking politics. But Peggy was not a part of this high society or accepted by Washington society matrons. She spoke loudly, lacked the social graces, and she was a flirt. She was not invited to the parties. In light of growing Victorian morals of restraint, sexual modesty, and temperate attitudes regarding alcohol consumption, Jackson's reputation was looking very gloomy with the circulation of the spoils system and the petticoat wars. Nonetheless, Jackson had many followers, especially hard-drinking farmers, frontiersmen, and fishermen. Jackson's political theory, making him very popular, held that government should offer its citizens equal protection and equal benefits, regardless of class or wealth. This position was a direct attack at the New Englanders who had long held political powers due to their wealth, their heritage, and continued political influence. Jackson wanted more opportunities for farmers and small businesses. As a Tennessee native son who became a self-made lawyer, grew up in a farming family, and saw himself as a Southerner, fellow frontiersmen looked to him to protect their economic livelihoods in a government that had been run from the beginning by wealthy plantation owners and wealthy merchant capitalists from New England and Virginia. Once Andrew Jackson entered the office of the presidency, the final crisis of the Indians and frontiersmen came to its final phase. In the north, tribes were scattered or had been moved to reservations. But in the southwest, south, midwest, and Florida, the Creeks, Cherokee, Seminoles, and other large Indian groups subsisted as farmers amidst the growing numbers of southern farmers using slave labor and getting rich off cotton production. Indians were resented by Jackson's constituency. Georgians and the Cherokee pushed the matter by 1827 to a head, with Alabama and Mississippi following the state's role in ridding their territories of Indians to make way for Southern planters. This was the situation when Jackson came to office. Indian nations argued in courts against the federal government that they had been protected under George Washington's Civilized Tribes Treaty. By 1830, the Supreme Court ruled in Cherokee Nations versus Georgia that the Indians were not a sovereign people, but domestic, dependent nations. And as dependents of the federal government and not of the states, they needed the protection and care of the highest power in the land. Under the policies of George Washington, American Indians settled in the Southeast were free to create farms and own property like other Americans, until these policies were overturned with Cherokee Nations versus Georgia. The federal policies stemmed from Jackson and his government's view on Native peoples, laid the foundation for official removal of Indians within states under the Indian Removal Act of 1830. President Jackson, and later under President Van Buren, saw Indian lands that could be used by their constituency and could be future voters. Like other Americans thought at the time, Jackson supported the notion Indians were not a part of regular society. They could never truly adapt to agricultural lifestyles, law, Christianity, and give up their traditional ways, so they would hinder growth of the economy at large. President Martin Van Buren upheld similar treatment to the Indians. During 1838 through 1839, nearly 16,000 natives began the journey that they called the Trail on Which We Cried. 4,000 died of malnutrition and disease in the course of a 116-day forced march. U.S. officials claimed that troops had carried out the removal with great judgment and humanity. However, an internal government report completed in 1841 revealed federal officials had reneged on even the most basic treatment and treaty promises. The report stated, quote, bribery, perjury, and forgery, short waits, issues of spoiled meat and grain, and every conceivable measure was employed by designing white men to remove Indians from their lands and way of life, end of quote. Many government agents seized goods such as blankets and food intended for Indians and sold these goods for profit. Military authorities suppressed the report, and the public never knew of it. Indentured apprenticeship, a legal covenant between apprentice and master, had for centuries offered supervision, training for economic livelihoods, and student provisions for use across the terms of the covenant, typically lasting between 7 and 9 years, while living under the roof of their master. While apprenticeship was common during the colonial period, in the new republic, parents and youths had no confidence in the unproven economic principles developed by the government. Other factors for its decline are cultural and due to the work environment in the United States. To begin with, Americans resist contributing their labor without receiving pay, even though unskilled, and they cost employers money until they are skilled. Likely this resistance has to do with 3 other factors. Number 1, the fact slavery existed in this country, and on-hands training is reminiscent of bonded labor. Secondly, without guilds to regulate the hiring of employees, this enabled unscrupulous employers to hire unskilled workers, which lowered the requirements to enter the adult labor market. And lastly, there was so much unsettled land in America, a young person could travel and set up his or her business with little or no training because services and or their skills were needed by residents. These 3 factors led to the decline of apprenticeship in America. The absence of apprenticeship opportunities or free education for the children from the lower ranks of society led to adolescent misbehavior, ignorance, civil and parental disobedience. This trend was most prevalent in towns and villages, as children of laborers or hourly workers had nowhere to spend their days as compared with children with at least one parent at home. Reform movements targeted established American social practices. For example, drunkenness, most noticeable among poor and wage-laboring men, was argued as the cause of family poverty abuse, breakup, and disorder leading to chaos and the demands for charity to be given. Activists promoted that something had to be done, otherwise this trend would create a heavy tax burden. The Second Great Awakening inspired the return to moral living as Americans adapted to changes in the 19th century with industrial trends. In the process, various reform associations targeted personal habits, such as the following. I would like you to consider these 5. Number 1, dress and diet. Number 2, conventional beliefs about sexuality, interpersonal relations, and conduct between men and women. Number 3, the economy, especially that slavery had to go and the nation needed to be more industrial. Number 4, the question of white middle-class women. Should all universities and college open to them, or should they have their own schools of higher education for those who could afford it? Should respectable middle-class women be able to vote or hold public office? And what about women in professions? And finally, number 5, institutionalization. Compulsory schooling for children under 16. The building of prisons. The continued growth and responsibilities of hospitals, factories, and poorhouses. If local governments offered a free education to American children, what form might it take? In the 19th century, American public school educators were skeptical how much reading was necessary, along with writing, to teach young children to become moral citizens. The first children's readers were the McGuffey, published in 1836 by a college professor and also a Presbyterian minister. The children's readers had moral tales of good deeds and were put together into rhyming story lines, encouraging children not to dilly-dally in their work, thus be hard-working, diligent, honest, and truthful. The McGuffey sold 7 million copies over a 20-year period. They were popular teaching aids in schools. By the 1830s, public school systems serviced white children. New districts developed in the North and Midwestern states. Single white women became popular grammar school educators, a new occupational outlet for them. School officials considered them mothers away from home. Black children had limited opportunities to attend regular schooling. In several states, teaching black children to read and write was unlawful. This condition would not change until after the American Civil War. During Spanish rule, American farmers and cattlemen were encouraged to settle in the northern Spanish territories, as they were sparsely populated by Spanish residents, and North American Indians were a constant threat. This foreign policy encouraged the assistance and growth of the struggling economy in the northern territories, a vast area from the Mississippi to the Pacific Ocean, from Vancouver to San Diego. Americans, black and white, rich and poor, owned property in the Spanish territories and developed economically. Then in 1829, the Mexican government abolished slavery, which affected the economies of all slave-owning enterprises. After Spain was invaded by Emperor Napoleon in 1808, the Spanish government had lost hold of its colonies, and slowly Spanish territories declared their independence. And this is how Mexico assumed total control of the Spain's former territories north of Guatemala. While Mexico declared its independence in 1821, with their decentralized government structure, the window for Americans to fight for the right to territories to the west had closed for the moment. After the War of 1812, America suffered economically and socially. Likely Congress would have resisted the urge to fight another war to possess the western states. But this day would come in the 1840s under President Polk. Then, in a political power play during the 1830s for government control, Mexican officials made dramatic changes in which centralization of authority was their goal. However, there was a growing resistance to Mexico's new plan for a strong centralized government. Internal disorder, otherwise known as civil war, resulted. General Santa Anna, president in 11 different elections over a 22-year period, wanted all provinces in Mexico to submit to the government in Mexico City, allowing the federal government, headed by the president, to hold the reins of power for the nation. Uprisings in Mexico occurred in 11 of their provinces. General Santa Anna was goal-oriented to retain control of former Spanish territories and to have the residents in those provinces pay taxes and obey government policies. In the end, 3 Mexican provinces formed their own republics. These are remembered as the Republic of Texas, the Republic of the Yucatan, and the Republic of the Rio Grande. The Great Diaspora means the Great Leaving. Between 1830 and 1850, 2.3 million immigrants entered the United States. Most were from the former Holy Roman Empire, Ireland, and Northern Europe. 2 major driving forces were, number 1, the Irish potato famine of 1847 and beyond, and also number 2, the European revolutions of 1830s and also 1848. These 2 economic and political realities led millions to leave their homes in hope of creating a better life in America. The Great Famine, known more commonly outside of Ireland as the Irish Potato Famine, is the name given to this event in Ireland between 1845 and 1849. The famine was due to the appearance of the blight, the fungus that became common on all potato plants that led to the rotting and death of the potato plant and its root vegetables. The famine continued until about 1851. The potato, along with buttermilk, was the primary diet of the Irish. This dependency on singular foods is most dangerous. Because of the Irish potato famine, it is estimated that 1 million died and about 2 million left Ireland, immigrating to the United States and other parts of the British Empire, such as Canada and Australia. The continental European revolutions of 1848 created a series of popular revolts. These are revolts led by the people, triggered first by the French. Nationalism movements fostered feelings of patriotism, while the common folk in nations demanded the right to vote and to voice their own opinions. In essence, to take part in the political process traditionally reserved for wealthy landowners. All the while, it was common knowledge in America those with little money or resources could vote. With low transportation costs, millions immigrated to the U.S. and Canada, looking for an escape from government systems in which they had no power or voice and oppressive religious conditions. The pattern of revolution was not experienced in Britain. Because of the Reform Act of 1832, changes were made in British electoral system. This allowed representation in the House of Commons for large industrial cities who had previously had little representation. This appeased the factory working class and the business sector, and property-owning middle class as well in Britain.